Trisha, can you stop the recording? Everyone, my name is Marian Lahav, and we'll get started in just a couple minutes. We'll give people a little bit more time to Zoom in with us. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you all for coming, taking this time out of your day to be involved with us in the update of the state's NHMP. And I'd just like to, Trisha, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so if you would please introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, your agency or affiliation, and the reason why you're here, then that would help us out a lot. And it won't take so much time then for us to go through introductions. So, whoops. Okay, so this is our agenda for today. We'll have a few minutes to start up here. We're just about there now. And the reason that we've called you here today is to ask for your assistance in reviewing and revising the 2020 Oregon Natural Hazards Mitigation Plan mitigation goals. And so we're going to start by talking about the risk assessment and what how they will influence the goals. And then we're going to talk about how to write good goals. And then we're going to start talking about how to review and revise the current goals and then what comes next. And at the very end, there will be a few minutes for community comment. So are there any questions about that? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on. And Chris, would you like to take it from here for a few minutes?
So I'm Chris Shirley with DLCD, and I am orchestrating the risk assessment part of this update. And I am also doing an upgrade of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan's risk assessment, which is a project that is independent of this, but obviously related. So I'm going to share just a little bit of some of our results from the preliminary risk assessment that we are working on. So what the risk assessment that we are doing supplements the existing products that FEMA provides. And if you look at the products that FEMA provides, they are very focused on identifying areas that have high value properties or activities. And so as a result, well, because they want to save money in their insurance payouts and responses. And as a result, most of the risk is found in the western part of the state. So our risk assessment is taking a little bit broader view of the situation, and we're including elements and indicators that go beyond the value of buildings or a blanket social vulnerability element to be more specific about what can be damaged and what social effects can be harmed as a result of natural hazard events. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so our risk assessment upgrade is statewide. Our purpose is to identify overlooked places, as I mentioned. We are integrating equity, inclusion, and social factors that are broader than are used by FEMA, and it will inform the natural hazard mitigation plan, but it will also extend beyond that to create a tool that can be used by cities, counties, tribes, and others to develop their own hazard mitigation actions. So we're using a model called multi-criteria decision analysis model called Promethi. And think about it. What we're doing in this risk assessment is saying, I want to identify places that are likely to be harmed physically and socially by a hazard event. What considerations do I need to take into account when I make that decision? So that's where the multi-criteria decision part comes in. Okay, we can go to the next one. So we have indicator values by hazard for all of the census tracts. And those are evaluated in the model. The input to the model is an Excel table. So once we get to the part where users can interface with the system, they can easily see the indicator values. It's not indexed, so you're seeing the raw values, and those are plugged into the model to prioritize areas for further investigation. All right, so the model results in a rank by census tract of areas that, given the decision criteria that we're using, are deemed most vulnerable to harm caused by the natural hazard that it's considering. So we're not looking at asset by asset, it's by census tract. And then again, looking at those tables, those input tables, you can look at the drivers of risk in those high risk census tracts. So of course, we're using a limited number of indicators. We can't characterize the whole world. It would be too difficult and time consuming to maintain all the indicators. So there will be trade-offs. There are no synergies among the indicators. So for example, if a hazard creates a poverty situation, that won't be reflected. It's just looking at what's there now. And the ranking does not reflect the magnitude of change. So unlike an index or a numeric value, you can't say this because it ranks 10 steps lower, it's 10 steps less risky. It is a ranking. All right, so we did 29 in-depth small group meetings to identify potential indicators, and from them we've identified a set that we will be using for this risk for the natural hazard mitigation plan update. And those are we're almost done with that project now. We do have some preliminary results. So the points that we did, the decision, indicators that we decided to use were based on expert agreement that they're related to the hazard and to the social vulnerability. They've been used in other situations, and the data is available publicly. Right. So how do we get to risk? So most of the indicators are vulnerability related. So we are including in the model hazard scenarios so that the exposure to the elements to the hazard and the probability of the hazard are wrapped in that scenario. So that's how we get to risk, using the exposure to the hazard time to vulnerability. So yeah, this is a big long slide. So the scenarios are for this natural hazard mitigation plan update will be somewhat restricted in their scope because we have a limited amount of time. But we'll work towards a more full description of the hazard probabilities later on. Okay, we can go on.
Yeah, what we have next is about writing the goals. And so, Chris, if we want to share maps, we can now or later, whichever you prefer.
Well, well, I don't have the ability to share, so
I
you
do.
will have to do it but let's show the flood preliminary results with the social indicators included. And I can explain a little bit. That's coastal flood. Oh, you're in the document. That's right.
Coastal flood, drought. Ooh,
Oh,
it's got a low flood.
here we go. Okay, so when you look at the FEMA map, the census tracts that are highlighted for flood are sometimes the same, but sometimes different than what our model is showing. And primarily, I want to show the eastern or the western part of the state. Primarily, our model is highlighting vulnerabilities and risk that exist in the the southwestern part of the state. The FEMA models don't really do that. So this is giving us some confidence that we're on the right track with our modeling effort. And then if you go over to the right side of the map there, where
Okay,
it shows the
back here.
indicators,
Oh,
go over to the that part. Yes. So
yeah.
every map, Dogami is producing these maps, and every one of them has the list of indicators that were used in to make that map, and the weight and the direction, meaning do we want more of it or do we want less of it? Actually, that's not quite right. It's -1 means it's less vulnerable, and 1 means it's more vulnerable, the indicator direction. So we are still uh, assessing the indicator set. We have about 5 that we still want to add that we've recently identified data for, and so those will be included in these maps in the next couple of weeks. So why don't we go to the map just a little bit? And I'm wondering if folks have
Right.
questions about what they're seeing here. And you did receive the package of maps for all of the hazards that we've evaluated, so you can take a look at them, keeping in mind that they are what we're calling V2. They're a refined version of our preliminary maps that we showed in October 1st, but we will have one more version that is even more refined coming out soon. So the idea is that these red areas are the highest vulnerability areas, and then we can look at the data input tables for those areas and determine what is driving the risk in those particular areas. And our intent is to target mitigation activities in those most vulnerable areas. So I think with that, we can move along, unless you want to show the mitigation map.
I can.
Yeah, let's show that, because I want to illustrate one of the reasons why we are taking this approach. Okay, so this is a map showing the composite FEMA National Risk Index scores by census tract, and I superimposed on that, the darker areas being the more risky. I superimposed on that the number of mitigation projects that have been deployed over the course of the last several decades, from 1994 to the present time. And you can see that we have made huge investments in the north west corner of the state, but other places have not seen similar investments. So this tells me that we need an approach that helps us target mitigation dollars to the places where they're really needed, or where we really find significant vulnerabilities. So,
Is
for
this
example,
dollars or is this just project count?
This is project count, and actually some of the projects have multiple buildings associated with them. But the
Dollars
overall,
would be different, right?
pardon me,
Dollars would be different.
dollars could be different. Yes, these are just projects. Um, yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily a failing on your part, Chris. I don't know if we have that data, and correct me
I
if
do
I'm
have
wrong, of
I do have
mitigation dollars that have been deployed at different areas across the state. If so, we could combine those analyses.
right, but this is just an illustration that
An example.
we have a need to find a way to diversify our investments. That's all this was meant to show.
Mhm, mhm.
So,
Back to the slides.
okay, so that's it with the maps.
Okay.
So are there questions from people about any of what you just saw? Can you go back, Tricia?
I have a question.
Okay.
This is Natalie Lillian-Wall at ODOT. In the dark areas, like in the center, how those are high risk, but how do we know the population? And
Well, this is from the FEMA National Risk Index, and you can get a lot of information by going to that website. I can't reflect it all um, on the screen here, or on this printout of the map. Yeah, it's showing that in FEMA's worldview, there are assets in those areas that are vulnerable to damage from natural hazards. And I can tell you from my working with the index that those are mostly wildfire damages in those eastern parts of
okay,
the state.
that makes sense. Thank you.
It does include buildings, agriculture, and uh, physical physical harm to people, which they've monetized. So the National Risk Index monetizes everything. So that's why you're seeing a lot of the high risk areas in the developed areas, because that's where the high value stuff is.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Don't be shy. Okay, then I guess we can move on. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to write and review the goals, and keeping in mind all the things that Chris just told us about, the NRI, National Risk Index, the risk assessment upgrade that she's been working on, and trying to link the goals to what we've just heard. So, what is a goal? There are a lot of opinions on this. There are a lot of intricacies or detailed differences between goals and objectives and strategies and other kinds of things that we talk about a lot. So I wanted to make sure that we are all on the same page here about what a goal is. So FEMA's definition of goals is the one that we really need to pay attention to for the purposes of this natural hazards mitigation plan update. But we can also keep in mind some of the other ways that are commonly understood as goals. So FEMA's definition is that goals are broad, long-term policy and vision statements that explain what will be achieved by implementing the mitigation strategy. The mitigation strategy, the heart of the mitigation strategy are the mitigation actions that we'll be developing and prioritizing later on in this process. But we need to think about the the things that we want to achieve. So other folks say that goals state the aims or desired results or accomplishments of a plan or activity. They state the end toward which the effort is directed and the intention of an activity or plan, and all those are correct. And to focus on our purpose here for the NHMP, we need to think about what we want to achieve in terms of natural hazards mitigation. What do we want to accomplish? And particularly in the next 5 years, because that's the life of the plan. So are there any questions about this or any other definitions that somebody would like to talk about? No? Okay, so moving right along. What makes a goal a good goal, a well-written goal? A well-written goal articulates clearly and succinctly what the state seeks to accomplish by implementing mitigation actions. So that's FEMA's. It's consistent with the hazards and vulnerabilities identified in the risk assessment, which is also a FEMA requirement, and is challenging but achievable. This is something that gives us something to work for. It's not something that's already necessarily in place, but it's where we want to go. And that's another thing we'll be talking about later on in the mitigation strategy is how do we get from the goals through the mitigation actions to, or through the mitigation actions to the goals? I mean, how do we get from here to there in the course of 5 years so that we have enhanced our natural hazards risk reduction and increased our resilience. So we want to stretch ourselves, but we don't want to stretch ourselves to the point beyond which we can't achieve anything. And goals should be SMART. So most of you are probably familiar with the SMART acronym. It stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So in the specific, it's what do we intend to achieve or accomplish? And in our case, our goals should be fairly broad, but not so broad that they're meaningless, and not so specific that they really sound more like a mitigation action. So we need to find the balance there. They need to be measurable. So let's think as we go through these about what data or metrics we could use to determine whether we actually accomplish the goal, accomplish what we desire to achieve. Like I just said, they need to be achievable. And in that, we can think about, do we actually have the resources to in place to be able to achieve these goals over the next 5 years? And if we don't, can we obtain those resources and accomplish the goal or achieve the goal within the next 5 years? Or do we not? And if we don't, then the goal either needs to be rewritten or rethought or held for later when we can. And then, is the goal relevant? Does it align with the risk assessment? Does it align with the state's overall vision for emergency management and mitigation? And is it time-bound? The life of the plan, as I mentioned earlier, is 5 years. So can we accomplish the aim or achieve the desired results within those 5 years? And again, we can stretch, and we should stretch, but not too far. Any questions about this? Yes, Murph. Hi, nice to see you again. You're muted.
Thank you for that. Hi, Marion. A specific question here would be, would I look at the FEMA/ESA BIOP as a goal, something that was set years ago and now is finally coming to life? So was that similar to what we're talking about now? So we're going to see a change in land use issues at local levels, or the fire-wise maps that we saw recently come out. Could these actually be related to what we're talking about right now?
Could be. I I would think that you'd want to, if you want to talk about the biop and what the state is doing to save salmon, we could make a more general statement about how a goal statement would be something more along the lines of how I guess it would be thinking about what natural hazards will impact the anadromous fish, and how we'd have to form a goal that was more general about how we could protect the fish and wildlife habitat or resources from natural hazards. So it might be something about sedimentation from landslides or earthquakes, liquefaction or something. I'm kind of grasping right now, trying to think out loud. And if anybody else has any ideas, please chime in.
I think that this is a good segue to look at the goals, which is our next slide, at our current goals. And then you'll kind of see the framework a little bit, I think, Mark.
Okay, thank you.
Hey,
And
before we
also-
do that, before we move along, Mike, Rob, did you want to say what's in the comment you just put in?
Hello. Yeah, I was just wondering how you integrate activities such as ODOT's 50-year mitigation effort into the hazard mitigation, state hazard mitigation plan. It's a much longer horizon, but it certainly should be elevated, I think, to be visible, with activities of all agencies, not just ODOT, but I mean all agencies, with respect to the Cascadia being, I think, the major natural hazard that needs, much more focus than what many of the West Coast states have been able to do. I mean, it's the worst disaster facing us, so I think it deserves, a lot of focus.
Yes, I mean, there's no reason we can't mention it, and whatever we can glean from that to help us within this 5-year time frame for mitigation would be very useful.
I can jump in here as well. So hi, Mike. I think you've asked this question before. And so these projects, this is the time frame for the plan. So the plan renews
Right.
on 5-year cycles, but the risk assessment is not what do we face within the next 5 years. The risk assessment does take into account for earthquakes, specifically crustal, which is on 2,500-year cycles, and CSZ, which is projected out over the next 100 years? Yes. And someone correct me if I'm wrong. And so we are able to project out those long range, including climate change, how climate change will affect natural hazards beyond the 5-year timeline. It's the 5 years refers to the update cycle.
Right.
And then the mitigation actions are, okay, what can we do for that? What can we do within the next 5 years that's feasible? So those are things, knowing exactly what you said. You're so right about CSZ being a really pressing issue. What are things that we can do within the next 5 years to retrofit, to mitigate what we know is coming? So if that answers your question, it's not a 5-year analysis, but it is a 5-year action. And Peggy, hello, good to see you again. How are you?
Good afternoon, everybody. Peggy Lynch, League of Women Voters of Oregon. Let me follow up with that question. So I get it. You're going to leave the earthquake situation in the long-term discussions and deal with 5 years at a time, but still remembering that this is a looming issue. But what about the fact that 100-year floodplains aren't really 100-year floodplains anymore due to climate change? What about those kinds of things? Are you going to be looking at different timelines for those maybe long-term events as you work on the 5-year plan?
Yes, Chris, do you want me to take this one or do you want to take this?
Go ahead.
I can. Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am. So non-stationarity is the term that you are referring to, and you are so right. So we take into account the 500-year as well as a proxy for future flood conditions. Flood is our most nuisance hazard, while also being a really protracted and difficult hazard to address. So we do take into account, yes, the 100 and the 500. Does that seem right, Chris, or do you have more?
Yeah, and also we are contracting with Ocre to provide us some indicators for future conditions so that we can evaluate the potential issues related with future heat waves, wildfire, precipitation, extreme cold. What am I missing? Drought. So we are looking at those future conditions to include in the risk assessment evaluation. So
Okay,
yeah, our model,
go
in
ahead,
our
Chris.
model, we hopefully, if things go according to what we think will happen, our model will be able to show how the risk landscape will change given future conditions. And therefore we can go to those places and develop mitigation actions.
There was somebody in between Murph and Peggy who I think was trying to speak, and I don't know, maybe that was you, Chris. I'm not sure. Does somebody else want to say something? Okay. So then let's move on. Okay, so FEMA has some requirements for goals. I'm sure you're all surprised. So, oh, just a moment. Okay. So there are three main requirements. One, again, goes back to the definition that we have to state what we want to accomplish. And they threw in there that we have to think about using a wide range of funding, not just FEMA's funding. So we can use funding from foundations, from the state, from wherever we can get it. And we need to think about that as we get through the plan. I think that'll be part of the mitigation action part, but that's one of their goal requirements. So we shouldn't limit ourselves to just thinking about goals that we know FEMA will fund. Also, again, we need the goals to be consistent with the hazards and vulnerabilities in the risk assessment. And third, they call out specifically high hazard potential dams. Those are certain dams that have a likelihood of killing at least one person. And there's a whole other program dedicated to high hazard potential dams, but we do want to incorporate it into our natural hazard mitigation plan as well. So the other thing about goals for high hazard potential dams is that you can have a specific goal addressing them like we do now, or they can be addressed more generally by being encompassed by other goals that we have that would pertain to them as well. So are there any questions about this? Nope. Okay, let's go on.
Sorry, this is Peggy really quickly.
Oh, hi, Peggy.
So what is the link between this discussion about high hazard dams and WRD's hazard dam program?
It's the same. I
Yep.
mean, what
One and
they
the
will
same.
probably work on, they follow all dams, not only high hazard dams. But they will be our point people for this, for everything to do with high hazard potential dams in that natural hazard mitigation plan.
Thank you. So I spent all morning talking about cooperation and coordination among water agencies. This is a different issue, but the same concept. We
Mhm.
need to have our natural resource agencies working together. So that's good to hear.
And here's our person from Water Resources, dam safety, Keith.
Yeah,
Keith.
so Peggy, that's a good question. And appreciate working with you on the legislation like 5 years or so. I'm still hanging in. I'm a part-timer. I'm partly retired, but we've been working with a lot of the counties meeting these requirements, and even though it's somewhat difficult with all the requirements FEMA has, we'll be drafting this consistent with that we've kind of got that down. I would say though, since I got an opportunity to talk, you could the discussions earlier about Cascadia subduction zone and what's going to happen. I've been to a lot of different states, and I think Oregon probably ranks like almost number one in our vulnerability. We're definitely number one vulnerability for an earthquake, but we have a lot of other hazards. And I really think need to really focus on a goal that protect, identifies safe locations and structures and minimizes effects on natural resources. And we have a lot of different hazards, and they're all over the state. And I was just at a presentation that Yumei Wang made at OMSI in Portland. I guess that was just a couple days ago, and it was really well attended, and people really want to know what to do. And I don't think Oregonians know that yet. And as state employees, we have an obligation, and to help improve the situation. And we have a long ways to go, but this could be a start with some real, a consistent, simple goal, and not get too much into the weeds. But really, one thing that's so important is just to inform people.
Keith, there's a question. Would you describe the dams that your program has authority over?
So we have authority, and the FEMA funding is for any dam that's at least 10 feet high and stores 3 million gallons of water. That's
Oops, we just lost you.
doesn't
Okay, Keith, we can't hear you.
have a federal agency, or Bureau of Reclamation has a number of irrigation dams, but we have the majority of the dams are regulated by the Water Resources Department. And we now have, from 5 years ago, there was just, or 6 years ago, I was the only engineer, and now we have 4.5 full-time equivalents. So, we've got a big backlog of things, but we're working on it.
Keith, I'm
So I
sorry.
think he dropped out.
Yeah,
but
you
he-
dropped out in and out while you were talking. So can you just say it one more time?
Yeah, he
Okay,
doesn't do
so
federal
can you hear me
dams.
now? Okay.
Yes.
So we regulate any dam that's at least 10 feet in height and stores over 3 million gallons of water, other than dams that are already regulated are owned by the federal government, where they're doing the regulation. So we do dams that store water, dams that store wastewater, mining lagoons, any structure that poses a risk of breach inundation downstream.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. I'm not sure why you were cutting in and out. Okay, any other questions, comments, concerns? Nope. Okay, thank you, everyone. Let's move on.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're gonna get to work. We're gonna spend, let's see, it's 1:42. We're a little bit later than I wanted to be, but we will spend a few minutes discussing each goal that we have now, our 2020 plan goals, and talk about how we can see them through the risk assessment. And then we'll talk about how to revise them. And we'll talk about whether we want to keep them, revise them, delete them, or maybe add to them or to another, or add another goal in particular. It would be nice if we could come to consensus, but if we can't, then we'll vote. And if the vote is inconclusive, we'll run it through the interagency hazard mitigation team for a decision. So, is everybody comfortable with that?
I think that sounds good. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so,
Yeah. About 5 to 10 minutes. So should I be timekeeper and keep
sure,
us moving
thank
along?
you. Yeah.
Great. Oh, and then first we have some recommendations from discussion from Chris and I.
Do you want to present those? Or
Do
should
I or just Chris?
Pardon?
Near Chris.
Sorry, I'll take this. So,
Okay,
we looked through the goals and came up with a couple of sort of overarching ideas that need to be better reflected in the goals, in our humble opinion. One of them is that a stronger emphasis on social vulnerability, and that's not only equity, but it's just the social conditions that exacerbate hazards that cause them to be stress multipliers. The next recommendation is that we need to integrate the IHMT and other multi-agency bodies into the recommendations. The who part of the recommend or of the goals is a little fuzzy. And as was mentioned earlier, it's interagency cooperation is so crucial in executing mitigation projects. And then finally, we want you to think about broader agency participation um, in mitigation planning, and that can happen through the IHMT or other venues.
Mhm. And then this is the last slide for recommendations.
Yes, and then many agencies are developing engagement tools and best practices to ensure that the whole community is involved in mitigation planning, and we want to think about incorporating those thoughts into our goals. Second here,
can I jump in here for a sec?
yes.
Whole community is in quotes because it's a FEMA term, which generally um, refers to a set of, I think it's 7 sectors. And so they're trying to encourage everybody to reach out to all possible corners of the community and bring them in or bring in representatives of those corners to participate in planning, in mitigation planning, not just on the state level, but on the local level for the tribes. So that's why that phrase is in quotes.
Okay. The next bullet is to build local capacity to ensure that mitigation funding is directed to most vulnerable areas. As you saw in the map that I showed you, the mitigation dollars have been, or projects have been focused on the northwest corner of the state primarily. And that is partly because those communities know how to play the game. They know how to get these FEMA grants. They've been through the rodeo before and they know how to do it. So we need to spread that knowledge into other vulnerable areas.
Right. This
And
isn't
then,
to say that every community has to get the same number of dollars, but that we need to build capacity so that the less resource communities can compete with the better resource communities, and that we can also use the risk assessment results to drive funding to those areas where it's needed and where it's needed, period.
And they may lack capacity to respond to opportunities.
Right, thank you.
And then in response to the question about the salmon and the biop, another idea that's not well reflected in the goals is to encourage use of nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, and so on, to address long-term mitigation and have nature help us reduce the harm caused by natural hazard events.
This is a weak spot in our current plan. It has been for some time. So the more we can do to strengthen it, the better. Okay. So we have this list now of our goals. There are 14 goals, and unfortunately, there's no way to really get them all up on the screen at once. So we're going to go through item by item and think about whether we want to keep it as is, refine it, revise it, delete it, or add to it.
And then after this, Marion, did you want me to share, or did you want to share to make our notes and revise?
Oh, well, I don't think we can share both at the same time, right?
No, unfortunately, you know.
Okay, so I think we'll just have to take handwritten notes and then we can talk about them.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, Matt Jensen, you have a question, concern,
Quick
comment?
question. As we go through these goals, are we going to make that recommendation right then? Or are we going to go through all 14 goals so we know if there's going to be addressed in other goals or how they relate to each other? Just that process.
Okay. I well, if you all can get to our website, which I put the link in the chat a little bit ago, then you can see all the goals at once. But we are going to go through them one at a time, and then we can go back and relook, through all of them.
Yeah.
So we could just read through all of them once. Why don't we do that? So number 1 is protect life and reduce injuries resulting from natural hazards. 2 is minimize property damage from natural hazards. Thank you, Jason, for putting that back in the chat. Jason just added the link to our webpage in the chat to the document that has all the goals on one page. Protect life and reduce injuries resulting from natural hazards, minimize property damage from natural hazards, minimize damage to critical or essential infrastructure and services from natural hazards, enhance the ability of Oregon's economies to rebound quickly from the effects of natural hazard events, minimize project impacts to the environment, and utilize natural solutions to protect people and property from natural hazards. Enhance the state's capability to implement a comprehensive statewide natural hazards mitigation strategy. Motivate here we are again, the whole community to build resilience and mitigate against the effects of natural hazards through engagement, listening, learning, information sharing, and funding opportunities. Eliminate development within mapped hazardous areas where the risks to people and property cannot be practicably mitigated. Number 9, minimize damage to historic and cultural resources from natural hazards. Number 10, enhance communication, collaboration, and coordination among agencies at all levels of government, sovereign tribal nations, and the private sector to mitigate natural hazards. mitigate the inequitable impacts of natural hazards by prioritizing and directing resources and investments to build resilience in the most vulnerable populations and the communities least able to respond and recover. 12 is develop, integrate, and align natural hazards mitigation and climate adaptation efforts based on the evolving understanding of the interrelationships between climate change and climate-related natural hazard events. 13 is reduce repetitive and severe repetitive flood losses. Chris, do you want to talk about what those are? Just briefly?
Yes, I can briefly say what they are. It's a FEMA term. FEMA has metrics for what they consider to be a repetitive loss property and what they consider to be a severe repetitive loss property. They have special mitigation programs to deal with those, to get them off the book so they don't keep flooding and they don't keep paying for insurance payouts to repair them. So that's it's a very specific FEMA flood risk reduction program or dollar loss reduction program, really.
Thank you. And finally, minimize or eliminate potential impacts from dams posing the greatest risk to people, property, and infrastructure. So that's our high hazard potential dam goal that I was talking about before, that we've called out specifically instead of housing it or, encompassing it in something else, some other goal. Okay, so let's flip back to the beginning. And if you can take a look also at, if you're downloading the material from the web, if you can take a look at the agenda and goal materials that Jason just sent the link to again. And let's think about the SMART goals also as we go through this. And so protect life and reduce injuries. Whoops. Oh, you got it. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Can everybody see that?
Very small.
Very small. Okay,
What about that? Try that on.
okay. That's better. We can't see
Okay.
every single one, but we can
Well,
see
I
most of
mean,
them.
yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's go to number 1. Is that, does it state what we want to do? What we intend to achieve or accomplish? Can you vote with your thumbs up?
Oh. Mm,
Is it broad enough or too broad? Can we measure it?
I think it's a great first goal. If this wasn't the first goal, I don't know what else is appropriate to be the first goal.
How would we measure this? We would have to have some data. Okay, Matt's putting his thumb down. Do you want to tell us what you're thinking?
Well, there's nothing measurable about that you need as you were just about to allude to, you need some sort of data over time, or you're not suggesting a goal of, 10 lives or 0 lives, it's too loose for measurable. That's all.
Okay. Does anybody have anything to add about that? Do we collect those? Do we collect that kind of data? Anywhere in the state?
This is Chris. I think it is collected, but it's not collected in a comprehensive and intentional way. In other words, Oregon Health Authority would have information about excess deaths caused by heat, and maybe we learn from the newspapers about injury and death caused by flood, but it's not collected in a comprehensive, systematic way.
Okay. So going to the third, achievable, it would seem that we have the authority and the expertise and the tools in place, but we haven't created a way to actually measure this yet, but we might be able to. Okay, we've got some comments out there, Peggy and then Susan.
Yeah, Peggy Lynch, League of Women Voters. So I hear the whole concept of how do we measure, but how do you rate if you lose one life versus losing 10 lives? I guess I'm just puzzled by the need or the ability to make a judgment decision based upon the loss of life, for instance. And then I wonder what the role of emergency management agency, the new emergency management agency, is to help with this kind of data collection.
Okay, Susan?
That's what I was going to ask, that I believe OEM, if there is a declaration or a disaster, during the recovery process, certainly data is collected about lives lost, and similarly for number two, property damage. But if something's not declared, I don't know how, yeah.
It's exactly the challenge with things like extreme heat. There's not a lot of property damage, and so it doesn't get declared as a disaster. This is Chris, by the way. The thing that, in response to Peggy, I'm thinking, the traffic people have fatality and injury dashboards where they report every year what the statistics are telling us. I don't think we have to make a judgment just to put the statistics out there. And then having those would help us determine whether we need to take more action to avoid those fatalities and injuries.
But we would have to have some agency or somebody responsible for collecting all of these disparate kinds of actions, because they almost all exist.
Yes, that's true. That's exactly what I was trying to get at. There's no systematic, comprehensive reporting mechanism.
Okay. So would this align with the message of the risk assessment?
I think so. I don't think we should get rid of it. I hear and recognize the potential modifications that we might need or want to make this a little bit more specific, but
so Mike DeBlasi said in the comments, it seems like a purpose rather than a goal. And I think he's right on there. Other thoughts about that? Okay, Peggy's got a thumbs up. Nobody else is showing anything. So Christy and then Murph.
goals 1 and 2 could be combined. Okay.
I was just gonna follow up with, like, I think we do need to differentiate between like a declared disaster versus a we have lots of wildfires in various ways, and so I think that we would need to understand what would that look like in terms of initial attack and some things like that are related to wildfire, and then like maybe even differentiating between, it's like we've had car accidents that start a wildfire where someone's died. Like we need to have some specific kind of determinations as to how it all comes into play and how that would work, and including things like if we have an injury for someone fighting a wildfire, is that the same as a public injury in terms of metrics and some things like that?
Okay. Yeah, this is more like a purpose statement. It could be a vision statement, a very long-term kind of thing. I'm sorry, Murph, go ahead.
Doesn't the insurance industry track loss, whether it be life and property? I mean, we do have stats that we can follow through an insurance industry that rates communities according to laws.
Hmm.
We often don't have access to that data. But I think this is Chris. I think the goal could be something like create a data collection protocol or dashboard
Matrix?
to track injury and harm, or to track harm, or something along those lines. Track harms caused by natural hazards. Otherwise, you can't really develop a metric if you don't have a database. Okay.
So if we, okay, so Bill says rewrite goal one and keep it. How would you rewrite it, Bill?
Well, maybe you put it like minimize loss of life or something like that, that just rewrite it so that it's not a purpose statement and it's more of a goal.
Okay, I think it might be harder to even track that, to track minimize, but I'm not sure.
I want to
Okay,
do a time check.
Yep.
yeah. Matt and Jason, and then we'll move on.
I'll yield to the time.
Okay, Jason?
Yeah, just a quick suggestion. If we're talking measurable, I think the goal would be no loss of life, no injuries caused by natural hazards, no matter how unrealistic that is. And then all the other goals kind of build off of that, and you can start to measure and make progress towards that higher level goal.
Nice.
What?
Nice. He said nice.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
All right, so I think maybe we elevate this to a vision or purpose or a mission statement and combine that with number two. Would that be acceptable to everyone? I think that's what I'm hearing. Okay, is there anybody who would disagree with that? Okay, Murph and somebody else. Let me see. Oh no, the hands came down. Okay, so let's say the decision on this one is to combine one and two, elevate them, and as a mitigation action, we could add a method for tracking. Does that sound good? Okay, let's go on. Well, we got two done. Okay, minimize damage to critical or essential infrastructure and services from natural hazards. So, does it state what we intend to accomplish? Infrastructure, critical or essential infrastructure could also include lifelines. And how would we track that and measure it? And do we have the resources to track it and measure it? And does it align with what we want to do and what the risk assessment is telling us? I would think it aligns with number one and two. And is it something we could accomplish within 5 years? Maybe not to zero, but we could make tracks on it, I think. What does everybody else think?
Sounds very much like the first two. It's talking about a broader purpose, but not a goal for what you're doing right now.
Okay, that could be included in damage, right? In number two? Is that what you're saying, Matt?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, Susan?
For this one, I mean, if it's more of a forward-looking goal, so increase the resilience of, critical or essential infrastructure. Something, and then further wordsmithing that I can't do on the spot, but so then if we are then looking back at where are we investing, how are we increasing the resilience of these important things?
And I think John Weeby is saying a similar thing in the comments. He says the statement suggests overbuilding infrastructure. Is that overbuilding, like building it more strong than maybe necessary? He's also suggesting removing minimize and replacing it with make more resilient. So if I didn't get that right, John, please pipe up.
No, that's correct.
Okay. And Susan, oh, you're done. Okay. Brendan.
Hi, sorry, computer's a little slow. For anybody who doesn't know me or hasn't met me yet, I work for Lane County's Office of Emergency Management. I manage the county's hazard mitigation plan. And I would just comment here, I think it is a little bit more broad and some of these goals in general, just given what the risk profile is suggesting about what you're seeing at the state level. So off the top of my head, I can tell you immediately on the infrastructure thing, locally here, bridge crossings, like how many bridge crossings across the rivers are going to be seismically upgraded and resilient to a standard to meet that 9.0 Cascadia event. If we remember the ice storm in January, our energy systems and supply chain, when we have a significant kind of rain, flood event, it could be atmospheric river, but a very significant ice storm, which we've had kind of recurring in the western part of the state a few years, utility poles, transmission lines, substations. Where's the state's role to influence or to state a goal of how you harden that material from the damage and the cascading impacts that we're seeing? And that's on the wildfire conversation too. So really this goal, maybe it is some sub goals beneath it, but what is that risk profile in sort of all the comprehensive things we're dealing with? It's, I would say, name it a little bit more directly than just critical or essential infrastructure, but really say what we're most concerned with is, yes, if these bridge crossings fail across the Willamette in the western part of the state, if these substations or, our Portland fuel hub up in the Portland, northwest part of Portland, that's 90% of the fuel state supply. If there is an issue with that, what are those downline impacts to the local communities where that is distributed out? What are the assets that then need to be, prioritized? And then, what is that impact on the census tracts that are highly social vulnerable, depending on what the impact is? So really marrying that in the goal, I think, is critical from the kind of higher state level perspective.
Okay. Jason?
Can I respond to that very quickly? The risk assessment includes in the decision criteria a density of critical facilities and infrastructure and lifelines. So hopefully our risk assessment will identify places that have a high proportion of those things, but it won't capture the downstream effects.
Right. So I guess my point about the goal is what is the goal telling me about the strategy, the prioritization of how the resources or how much emphasis is placed on particular projects? Because getting all those bridges, let's use that as an example, that is probably more than a 5-year process. What is going to happen within those 5 years, though, on a trajectory of 15 to 20, knowing that we have that event that will happen? And what infrastructure then, to what extent is that infrastructure going to fail? Because we have fatality projections from Dogami for our region for a Cascadia event. How many more lives would be impacted by a failure of those bridges? And we have one hospital on one side of the river for metropolitan area. So that would be what I would see reflected in the goal, is maybe bridges in general in kind of a regional context, because minimize damage to critical or essential infrastructure that's a value statement to me, but I don't know what you're working on first or where you're working on it or how it fits into the whole systematic risk at that higher level that the state's looking at.
So
I
the
think that's a really great segue to, sorry, Marion, can I jump in? And to maybe you're going to do the same thing as me, is to give kind of a larger context into the project that we're working on now and the connection between the goals and our mitigation actions. And because what you're outlining is, this you're seeing these broad goals, and then you're saying, where's the specific? How do we speak to these specific vulnerabilities? And so, Marion, maybe you were going to go there. That's where we can really dig in with mitigation actions. So it is to our advantage, I think, and I hope others would agree with me, to keep to speak and have these goals speak to different themes, maybe, but keep them broad enough that those mitigation actions can apply to multiple goals or kind of touch on and pull up one thread within the goal that you can cover a lot of landscape with a goal that speaks more to a theme than to a specific action. And I think this kind of points to Bill's comment here about, are we talking about specific action items when we're talking about goals right now? No, we're not talking about specific action items. Those are mitigation actions. Right now, we're kind of at the broader level.
Okay, and Mike Rupp had a suggestion in the chat that we should establish a database that tracks completed hazard mitigation projects that shows we're achieving our goals. The database would be updated and displayed in the state hazard mitigation plan every 5 years. So yeah, I think OEM is starting to do that, but we have further to go.
Yeah,
And
there's quite a few states that I've seen also, or big cities that have these sorts of trackers, and it's actually really interesting to watch, like to look at. So I'm excited to see that.
yeah, and John, thank you for corroborating my statement. Okay, so Jason and Matt Jensen, thank you very much for waiting for so long. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, just a quick thought on goals like this where you have terms that likely are defined somewhere, like critical or essential infrastructure. I know probably a lot of us know what those things mean, but if they are actually specifically defined, to capitalize those and kind of refer back to what is essential infrastructure or what are services that we're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, our current NHMP has a glossary and we will have one again. And Matt?
So my question is this is taking a step back. Are these goals and everything, is this part of the state of Oregon National Hazard Mitigation Plan? Or is this a guideline for jurisdictions within the state of Oregon for their national hazard mitigation plans?
This is intended to be that what we do to these goals right now are intended to be included in our updated natural hazard mitigation plan for the state. You can steal them if you like, or or use the ideas behind them in your own natural hazard mitigation plans.
The reason I was asking is that, as much as these goals are so lofty, it'd be really good to be able to point to something in that document that these goals are tied to. So is this part of chapter 12? Or where do, I mean, and since I'm only seeing just a small portion of this larger document, I'm not sure how the whole structure works, because as much as I like goals as a planner, they need to be able to relate and have that foundational information to be able to justify what we're asking for.
Right. Right. I think so the risk assessment will be foundational in that regard. And so first we're looking at these more general things that we can accomplish over the next 5 years. And also they're big enough to go beyond the 5 years. but our mitigation actions are going to stick to that 5-year period. And the mitigation actions are going to be tied back to these goals. So everything will be tied together. Right now, the way we do it in our plan is each mitigation action, we have a big table and it shows which goals it speaks to, which goals each mitigation action speaks to. And I think we're going to go a step beyond that this time and really explain more clearly how those mitigation actions help accomplish those goals. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, but I let's just keep moving on. I think the more we know, the better it'll get.
Okay, Peggy?
To follow up on that, so when the state has its National Hazard Mitigation Plan, are you responsible for taking some action when local mitigation plans are adopted, as in other kinds of things that happen with land use? And if so, it would seem to me that the state program would have some linkage, even if not specific linkage, to local planning.
Well, we would like for local natural hazards mitigation plans to be integrated into local comprehensive plans. That is happening in some cases. In other cases, it's not. Sometimes they're fully integrated in terms of putting words from one into the other. Sometimes they are simply appended to the comprehensive plan, and sometimes nothing is done. We would like to see more local governments integrate the NHMPs with their comprehensive plans.
So there is a linkage, and I think Matt's question was well-founded. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we should definitely have a goal of saying, well, how many of our local jurisdictions have, you know, or are looking at this or referencing this, or, you know, just so that it's great that the state's looking at this really top high level look at it, but we're trying to make something that's more, I guess, usable and applicable,
Yes.
especially if we're going to be issuing grants towards it. It needs to be relatable, and so and that's relatable. I think is much easier is at the jurisdiction, the local level.
Yes. Well, part of what DLCD does, and the University of Oregon and other consultants around the state, we help local governments update their plans and their natural hazard mitigation plans. And we try to make ourselves available as much as we can for them to help them integrate the natural hazard mitigation plans into their comprehensive plans. Sometimes they will do just the goal 7 part, that is areas subject to natural hazards, and sometimes they undertake a bigger update of their comprehensive plans. But we're always here to try to help as much as we can. It's really up to the local government to want to do it and to ask us for assistance. No, we can talk more about that offline too. I'd be happy to talk with you. Okay. I think it's getting later. We've got a lot of suggestions on the current goal 3. So, Tricia, can you just give us a synopsis and see what kind of conclusion we can come to?
On the goal language?
Okay, so we have minimized damage to critical essential infrastructure. And you have down that we should include measurement language about building infrastructure and community resilience, and includes specific language around bridges and differential vulnerabilities to hazards. And I think we talked about doing that more in mitigation actions and
Yeah.
and
And then we
keeping,
kind of, we like kind of went somewhere else onto a different goal entirely. I think goal 6 when we talked about integration. And that's when I started to be like, let's wrap this up.
okay, so there was also a suggestion to move goal 3 into goals 2 and 1 and elevate them elevate all those ideas. So property damage also
Okay,
would
I think
include
that's for that.
what?
I didn't get that.
Okay, am I
Wrap goals.
misunderstanding?
I thought it was just goals 1 and 2, but okay.
Okay, maybe that was just me thinking about that, because damage to critical or essential infrastructure, lifelines, and all would also be property damage. And then there was, I'm forgetting who said,
Okay, we
to,
can go back at the recording to catch the notes. We probably want to
yeah.
move on now.
Okay, well, I wanted to come to some sort of conclusion if we can about what to do with goal 3 instead of just leaving the conversation hanging. And
Do you have a proposal, Marianne?
well, I'm trying to synthesize what I've heard to try to make a proposal. So, is it Brian? Brendan, sorry, I keep getting your name wrong. I apologize. Where you were talking about the specifics, and I'm thinking that the specifics really belong in mitigation actions, but we can talk about damage to critical or essential infrastructure and lifelines as damage, property damage from natural hazards, or and so we could include that idea in 1 and 2 in a broader sense, and then take the specifics that you talked about and the cascading impacts and talk about those in mitigation actions. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and if I wasn't articulating my perspective clearly enough, that's essentially what I was sort of talking about. That specificity belongs in the action items, but maybe something as general as harden Oregon's surface transportation system for a seismic event. That's not at the level specific, but it does call out the fact that the transportation system is exceptionally vulnerable. Cascadia is the one we kind of all think about, but there are other hazards that will impact people's, welfare, property damage, that the transportation system is implicated. So I think that was really just what I was trying to communicate, of a level down, not into the specific bridges or the specific regions, but what is the domain of focus. And transportation and energy have just been 2 examples that are on my mind, just given the past year we've had here in Oregon. So that was all.
Okay, thank you. Jason?
Peggy had a good suggestion in the chat just to change the first couple of words to increase resilience of the infrastructure.
Oh, okay.
It offers kind of a broader approach to
Okay,
strategies.
great. That helps. Right. And Marv?
Thank you. What comes to mind here when we talk about critical infrastructure, I hear a lot up here about profit-driven infrastructure, which would be like power lines. Why aren't they in the future put underground? Things of that nature are something to encourage undergrounding our electrical system. It's a little different than bridges or highways, so to speak, that are public owned. There's resistance saying that it costs 4 to 10 times expense to underground a line than it does to run them through the trees or in the air. So, what's our future? And this is a question I've asked multiple times in committee meetings that, 100 years ago, they ran the power lines up through the trees, nailed to them and whatever, and they were bare lines. 100 years from now, are they still going to be there? Because we don't see any future in undergrounding them. So are we going to minimize our transmission or our generation areas, perhaps with hydrogen in the future or something of that nature to minimize that transmission route? Or, what's our goal?
Okay,
So this is a huge subject.
it
as far
is.
as
It is. And then there are the cascading impacts from, like we saw in Hawaii, the heat got to the wires and caused a wildfire that killed people, everything. Okay, let's go on. Thank you for that. I made a note of it. Okay, so number 4. We're running out of time here. So let's try to move as quickly as we can. If we need to continue this, we'll find a way to do that. Enhance the ability of Oregon's economies to rebound quickly from the effects of natural hazards.
And Peggy has her hand up, Marianne.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see it. Thank you. Go ahead.
So thank you. Really, Peggy Lynch, League of Women Voters of Oregon. So it talks about economies, but I am thinking of the 2020 wildfires and the Phoenix and Talent area. And you're talking about economies, but I wonder where the conversation is around the people and their housing and whole communities and not just economies. So this is one where I see the DEI conversation really explodes for me. And I don't have a specific answer, but I do worry that this doesn't focus enough on people.
Okay. How would you change it?
That's what I said. I don't have a specific answer,
Oh,
except
okay.
that instead
Sorry.
of economies, I'm wondering if we're saying communities instead of the word economies, which would include economy and housing and others.
Okay.
Thank you, Susan. That's exactly right.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Gianna?
Hi, Gianna Lessie, DLCD, Natural Hazards Planner. I think we should change the language from rebound to something that is more perhaps a resilient, because to me rebound sounds more like it's returning to pre-disaster function, which that's not really possible. So it's maybe too resilient to go, to return to functioning as soon as possible, or have the adaptability within their systems, already to be able to, get back to normal or get back to functioning after a disaster. So I think that resilience or something related to resilience would be a better word, because that is more indicative of.
Okay, thank you. Susan has in the chat whether economies could be changed to communities. Oh, you've got that. Okay. And Murph?
Peggy nailed it. This is something I was waiting for. Pre-transition housing planning. Instead of trying to find a place to put FEMA trailers after a disaster, we should be planning for the placement of these and have the infrastructure in place to handle until homes are built in a smart way. I'll stop there.
Okay. So it sounds like that could be an add to our list. And number 4 could be changed to incorporate all the different and related ideas that you've mentioned. So I guess in a nod to Matt Kroll, I think I won't try to wordsmith that for now, but we'll get that on. And I think given our time limit, we'll get through as many of these as we can, and then we will send it out for review. Okay. Does that sound okay for everyone?
I just want to have somebody help us find a different word than rebound in the conversation, because we do want to look to the future, and I don't have an answer.
Gianna suggested resilience instead of rebound. It goes back to that diagram, the resilience diagram, where you can either come back quickly or slowly from an event, but the question is whether you come back um, to pre-disaster or pre-event functioning or go beyond that to resilience, right? So that's what she's suggesting. Would that do it for you?
Yeah, figure out how it fits in the, I think you have the idea. You can figure it out later. We can go on.
Okay, great. Number 5.
Yeah, Marion, just a suggestion, if I could, this is Kirsten, as you're moving through here, maybe not to try and resolve today, but to get the ideas out for each one and then just really focus on people's guidance and be making notes of those. And then you could put back out a staff response and suggestion.
That's what I just said a minute ago. We're thinking on the same lines. Okay. So number 5. Minimize project impacts to the environment and utilize natural solutions to protect people and property from natural hazards. So that goes back to
Gianna
what.
has her hand up and so does Jason.
Okay, thank you. I'm moving the comment thing around and I just moved it on top of your hands. I apologize. Okay, Gianna.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to put my hand down. Sorry about that.
Okay, Jason.
For number 5, this almost seems like it's so overly vague. It's not really a goal. It speaks a little bit more to strategies that you would find under the other goals. You could almost recommend deleting this. I hate to say it, but it just seems so broad and vague. And I think it would get picked up in the other goals and strategies.
The thing we haven't talked about in the other goals and strategy goals at this point is the environment, and we didn't want to lose that thread. But I think we had a recommendation, excuse me, about this one. Chris, is that what you were going to talk about? Or something else?
Excuse me. Sort of. What I was going to suggest is that actually, I think there are 2 goals in there. One is the minimize project impacts, and the other one was natural solutions.
Right.
They're different.
Right. I also think that minimize project impacts to the environment is covered, at least when FEMA's dollars are used. In other cases, they may not be. And that could go to a mitigation action. And use natural solutions to protect people and property from natural hazards is one that I think was in our recommendations.
Exactly.
Okay.
I think they are separate.
Okay. Mike?
Yeah, there we go. Well, I think using the part about the natural solutions is the process of how you do it, but when you have it vaguely about, well, I guess when all the other potential goals could be to the detriment of the natural environment, in that, like, say, you're trying to build something that is resilient to a flood of, say, a 500-year flood. Well, there are multiple ways of doing that. So, you can do it in a way that allows for a floodplain and wetland to be inundated, or you could do it in a way that builds, flood walls of concrete. So, I guess it's really how it's written, and I know FEMA's got money and goals but that isn't always the outcome, or those goals don't always stay that way. So I would, I guess, trying to be as specific as possible as to what it means by and if you could scroll up a little bit so I could see the exact language again, where it says, minimize project impacts to the environment. That's a goal. Utilizing natural solutions to protect people and property from natural hazards it's kind of like an overarching thing, not necessarily just for a specific project, but it's kind of a hazard mitigation practice beyond just response to a project being built or an actual hazard event happening.
Right. Okay.
I don't know if if that was clear. That's what I was trying to say, but
I think we have you there. Do the notes capture that at all?
I think, yeah, what I see your comment really falling under is that this is two goals, and one being about project impacts and the other being about nature-based solutions. And we were thinking along very similar lines. I think we're on the same page, yeah. I think your comment is yeah, pretty accurate.
Okay, Jason also mentioned in the comments that, in the chat, that some might say the environment is critical infrastructure. That's a really cogent point, so thank you for that. Okay, let's move on to 6. Enhance the state's capability to implement a comprehensive statewide natural hazards mitigation strategy. That implies that we don't have or do that now. And that would, I think, encompass some of the conversation we had earlier about institutionalizing some of our groups, and also creating more opportunities for cross-pollination. And Chris, you have your hand up?
Oh, sorry. It's legacy.
Okay. So does anybody else want to speak to that?
Well, actually, I will say something about that. I think that our revised risk assessment is an attempt to help achieve this goal.
I think this is a big overarching umbrella kind of thing. It's
Yeah, this is where our recommendation are, well, our noticing of what was coming out of the risk assessment, but then also kind of anecdotal evidence of integration of plans, of agency reports, things that are shared at bodies like the IHMT. So that's where our recommendation to institutionalize the IHMT and include a broader selection of agencies, not just emergency management and some natural resource agencies, to kind of become more comprehensive, right? When it comes to our hazards mitigation strategy, and be not only aware, but like integrating the tools and products that we have at the agency or at the enterprise level. That's, I think, where we're
I
going
think
with
that's
our
where we're
suggestion.
going, right? Murph?
Also making the risk assessment usable, because right now it really isn't.
Mark?
Yes, adopting current hazard mapping that's out there that we're not recognizing, such as challenge.
Yes.
I have to throw that in there.
Yes. Okay. thank you. So 7, motivate the whole community to build resilience and mitigate against the effects of natural hazards through engagement, listening, learning, information sharing, and funding opportunities. So this would be a very big, I think, in community involvement program. Matt Jensen says in the chat, if this NHMP is for the state, then are we listing the state's infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams, utilities? If so, then we could collect and track that data easier for SMART goals. I think, yes, in a sense, we did that prior. It's in the appendices to the 2020 plan. But at this point, I think that's in the risk assessment. Okay, Keith, and then Susan, and then Peggy.
Yeah, so this one's a real important one. You know, you can't motivate the communities unless they're informed. So I think part of this, even more important than the term motivate, is kind of have sessions where people can learn about their risks. When I was in that session at OMSI a couple days ago, people really had a lot of questions and really didn't understand the earthquake risk, but were interested to learn more. And you made it a great job, but a lot of the other hazards we have, people have very little information. Sometimes we in the agencies have information, but we don't have a standard way to share that necessarily, and not with the whole community. You know, I think tsunamis, Dogami did a good job getting the signs up, but at the coast, and I think people are aware of that hazard. And wildfire, we've done a pretty good job on, but the rest of the hazards, a lot of people just don't seem to have any idea of. And to some extent, the FEMA floodplain maps for the regular flood hazards, especially with the storm's going to be changing as the temperatures go up. They're sometimes not helping people get safe. And I'm actually going to go to North Carolina and see what happened there. But yeah, we have. I think it's really important to have to focus on informing communities.
Okay, thank you. Susan.
I also was just going to call out the word motivate. I think people may be motivated, like he said, but don't have information. And then I was just also thinking, like, what's the state of Oregon's role? You know, I mean, state agencies have some responsibility, but a lot of this also lays in the laps of, you know, our local partners. So as a state and state agencies and state government, can we provide, you know, more resources or technical assistance or money or, you know, things that can help these messages get out further? So I think motivate puts too much, like we're saying, you people need to be motivated to do these things. And I think we as government need to be doing more. Yeah.
Okay. Did you have something you wanted to say otherwise, Peggy? Thought you had your hand up.
No, that's the issue. Educate, inform, anything but motivate. And we need to make sure, again, the outreach, the whole I don't know what the whole community definition is of FEMA, but I want to make sure that whatever techniques we use to do the education and information, that it reaches to people who are single families and have 3 jobs and can't go to meetings, and all of those kinds of strategies around engagement that are so important to deal with. Okay. So that everybody, and particularly since they are the most vulnerable in most cases for most hazards.
Okay. Okay, just making notes. All right, so we're up to number 8 now. Eliminate development within mapped hazardous areas where the risks to people and property cannot be practicably mitigated. So this is talking about prohibiting development in places where you can't mitigate sufficiently to protect people and property. Oh, we've got comments from Murph and Jason.
Who first?
You.
Yes, I agree. I like the way it's written.
Okay. Jason?
I think eliminate and mapped hazardous areas are measurable. I think it would just rely on defining what it means to practicability mitigate. That's the big $1,000,000 question.
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion around that the last time, and I think that basically local governments have the local governments that do have regulations about this have determined what their risk tolerance is for those areas. And I think that's what it comes down to. But from the state level, we're saying that we would encourage local governments not to develop where there's a good risk of harm. So yeah, but how to measure that is a big question. Okay, Peggy?
So just to respond to your comment about local governments making the decision, but the state and the rest of us taxpayers often have to pay the bill. So we do have some state responsibility around what the local governments are deciding, because it does end up, we're the ones that end up paying for risks that aren't mitigated at the local level.
Well, that's correct. Okay. At the moment, though, we don't have anything that at the state level that makes this a requirement. And even in the state, even in this plan, it's not a requirement. It's and pardon, Chris, go on.
Could make regulations around goal 7.
That would be a mitigation action.
Right.
We get to that. Okay. Mike.
I would say that, well, two things. I agree with the thrust of this one. Seems like the insurance industry would be a good guide as to where they're willing to insure. It's one thing for a city to say, yeah, we're comfortable with that risk because we expect FEMA or whomever to come in and pay for the cleanup, but the insurance companies are much more hesitant, and so I think they'd be a good source of information as to where they are comfortable with insuring.
Right. And Brendan put in the chat that we'd measure this goal through plan integration at the local level between NHMPs and goal 7 of the comp plan, as Christine identified. So that's also a pertinent comment. So we could maybe keep this goal, and a mitigation action coming out of it would be to make some requirements from the goal 7 that would speak to this and the measurement. So, okay. Moving on. What time is it? It's 2:51. Before we finish, is there anybody here from the public who would like to comment? So we have 5 minutes on the agenda for our public comment or community comment, and if there's anybody here who would like to do that, we could do that now. Just raise your hand. No? Okay, then we get those 5 minutes back. All right. So number 9, minimize damage to historic and cultural resources from natural hazards.
This might be a good juncture, forgive me, but it might be a good juncture too to just talk about what to do on the final goals between this and your next meeting.
I had suggested before that we would put together these comments and put together the comments in new language and send it out for review.
So people could then respond with any
Mhm.
further thoughts they had on 10, 11, 12, 13, or 14. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so let's just get as many comments in as we can so we can do the best job we can on that. Okay, so historic and cultural resources. Peggy.
I really want to take Kristen's advice, and I'm going to say that goal 12 in your list needs to be moved up tremendously, because that is one of the most important parts of what will happen and what needs to be happening around the natural hazards. Sorry, just wanted to get that in.
Okay, so that one says develop, integrate, and align natural hazards mitigation and climate adaptation efforts based on evolving understanding of the interrelationships between climate change and climate-related natural hazard events. Is there any change that we would want to make to that? Keep it as is, add to it?
Chris, I would take out develop and integrate and just say align.
Okay. Any disagreement with that?
I just want to make sure you get the idea that number 12 should be number 1 or number 3 or 5 or something other than number 12.
Right.
Thank you,
We've
Peggy.
got that in the notes. Okay. We're technically not ranking these, but we take your point. Okay, so let's go back to where we were. Number 9, minimize damage to historic and cultural resources from natural hazards. Any changes to that, Jason?
Just a quick question. It seems like a handful of these goals are all about minimizing damage. And so each of the ones are kind of specific: historic and cultural resources, property damage, critical infrastructure. Is that on purpose because we want to draw attention to these unique features, or can they be combined into a single with a list of things to protect?
Either way. I think either way would work. Anybody else have a preference?
9 could go back into your combined, if we're talking about minimizing property damage, critical facilities, infrastructure, could add in historic and cultural resources there.
Yeah, that's what Jason was saying, like have a minimize damage goal and then list all the things that we want to minimize damage to underneath that. So, okay. That one isn't raising a lot of concern here. Okay, enhance communication, collaboration, and coordination among agencies at all levels of government, sovereign tribal nations, and the private sector to mitigate natural hazards. Any issues with this one?
I was
Keep
just
it,
wondering.
delete it.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. Go
Saving
ahead.
time. I'm not raising my hand. I know the private sector includes like community-based organizations, but I think that might be worth calling out the nonprofit or, faith-based. I mean, these are all a lot of the whole community types of organizations we're trying to engage. So if we could specifically call out, or I don't know,
Yeah.
further elaborate
okay.
on private sector. Yeah.
Also, a lot of the social vulnerability representatives are in that group. Okay. Any other comments on this one? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to 11, this is something Chris was talking about earlier. Mitigate the inequitable impacts of natural hazards by prioritizing and directing resources and investments to build resilience in the most vulnerable populations and the communities least able to respond and recover. So we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about how the western part of the state has gotten all the, or most of the investment because they know how to obtain it. Are there any revisions you'd like to make here? Okay, Peggy?
So I get it. I understand it. It's exactly true, except that if we're directing these resources to this group of population when we are likely to kill a greater number of people in another area, it's a difficult goal to meet or to, because I certainly believe that that's exactly right, that this is where people are least likely to get the money. On the other hand, part of the reason that the Northwest area gets so much money is because that's where the people live, the most people live. So trying to figure out the value of a life is really tough. But I do have some concerns about how we word number 11.
Okay, understood. Maybe we'll talk during the next week. Or, feel free to email us if you have suggestions at any time.
You could put in a note something like balance number of people with the vulnerabilities of communities or something. I don't know. That's just a placeholder.
Yeah.
Okay, we can talk more about that one and see where we go from there. Any other thoughts or comments or concerns about that?
You're at 3 o'clock, Chris, 2:59.
Oh my goodness. Okay, thank you. All right. So we only have 2 left. And the one is the dams, and that could also be encompassed in the property damage one, and reduce repetitive and severe repetitive flood losses. That's something we also need to have here to qualify for the National Flood Insurance Program. So I think we're done for today. And we did a lot in a little bit of time, and we'll be revising these and getting them back to you based on your comments and our discussion for review. And the next steps, we're on a really race toward the finish line here, and we're just beginning that race today. So the next steps are for the next 2 Friday meetings, which are the only meetings between now and the end of this month. We'll be talking about criteria for awarding mitigation grants. And this is something that we are required to have in our plan, talking about grants that go to jurisdictions for projects and for plans and for capability and capacity building. And they don't stand alone. They will be used in conjunction with other criteria that come out in the announcements for FEMA's grants, but it can also pertain to other grants that we might get outside of FEMA. So these are going to be some hard discussions, and the discussion that we had today and the review of the goals will really help us in these discussions coming up. So the first one is for determining the criteria, and we're going to come with some things for you to look at, and then we'll work on prioritizing the criteria in the following meeting. So that's it. Thank you very much. It's been a terrific discussion, and thank you for this last extra minute for me to say that and prime you for the next meeting. So we hope you'll all come again and come to as many of these as you can. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Trisha, this is going to download on your computer, I think.
Will you stop the share, Miriam,
Will I stop the share?
or the record?
The record, yes.